Welcome, everyone, to the Our Time to Rise podcast. This is an incredible episode. I already know it, and we have not recorded it yet because we are talking about a topic that impacts a lot of us and in different ways. But we are specifically talking about people we love that are in recovery and how we can love them well from the sidelines. So, as the person who is standing next to the person in recovery, what is our role? What is a healthy approach? What even really is recovery? What can we expect from this process? Maybe it's an adult or a teenage child. Maybe it's a spouse. Maybe it's a sibling or a parent. I can think of a friend who recently had a parent who went through rehab, and it completely surprised her that her mom, close to 80 years old, but addiction does not discriminate as far as families go. And we're going to talk in depth with our guest, Caroline Beidler. She is a person who has walked a recovery road, is still walking it. She is 15 years in. She also has her master's in social work and is the managing editor at recovery.com, which is a global resource connecting individuals and families to trusted treatment options. So we're going to be talking about treatment options. She has even been an invited speaker at the United Nations just this March, addressing the topic of women and recovery on an international stage. So straight from the United Nations to the Our Time to Rise podcast, it is so good to welcome Caroline to this time, to this conversation. Welcome, Caroline. Thank you already for sharing with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm just really delighted to be here.
Yeah, well, I know that people pushed play because there was something in them that said, yes, this would be helpful in my life. Maybe they thought of a particular person they knew right away, or maybe they just thought, I'm helping my friends who are dealing with helping their loved ones. Whatever reason, I feel like it would be helpful if we defined some terms at the beginning so that we're all using words in the same way. So, can you tell us, as far as addiction and recovery go, what do you mean when you use those words?
Thank you for those questions. I think sometimes we forget the importance of defining what we're talking about and really setting that stage. So, addiction has been termed so many different things by different types of people over the years. So, some folks have called it a brain condition, a disease, a moral failing. Some folks have referred to it in all sorts of different ways. I've heard the term spiritual malady, in some recovery pathways talk about that. And really what the research shows is that addiction is something that happens in the brain, and it also happens in the body, in the spirit, with our emotions. And so it's this thing that can kind of take us captive almost. And one of the things I think is important to think about what characterizes addiction is this loss of control. So we might have intense cravings. We might experience physical withdrawal from a symptom. We might be obsessively thinking about, when is it going to be 5 o'clock? When can I pour that glass of wine? Or when can I pick up my phone again? Some of us may be able to relate to that. I think I have my phone sitting right next to me. It's always next to me, So it's like we become, I don't want to say obsessed, but it's almost as if we are taken over by whatever the thing is, fill in the blank, whether it's alcohol, drugs, pornography, phones, Netflix, food. And so something shifts and can happen in our brain then. And there's a whole neuroscience behind addiction. I'm not a neuroscientist, but I've done a lot of research on that. Interestingly, the neural pathways in our brains actually change when we are addicted to a substance or addicted to a behavior, and do that behavior over time, that repetitive motion. So those are some of the things. And I'm not answering your question directly. And one of the reasons for that is because so many of us see it in different ways. I think, and part of my passion really around this topic is to make sure people understand it is multifaceted. It doesn't just impact one person. It doesn't discriminate. as you shared when we were chatting a little bit before we started today, addiction impacts, I would argue, almost every human being. It is a human condition. It is a human struggle. It is one of the many troubles. I think that when Jesus talked about in this world, you will have trouble, I think it's one of the troubles that we experience as a human. And so on the flip side of that, we have recovery, which if folks were looking at my face, I can't not smile when I say the word because it brings me so much joy and has just brought my life into this new place of freedom. I love talking about it. I love sharing about it with other people. But recovery is the opposite of that captivity. It is, in fact, a freedom from. It's a freedom from obsessive thinking about a substance or a fill in the blank. It's a freedom from a physical addiction or those physical symptoms of withdrawal. It's a freedom from that emotional, that desire to use, to escape or numb. And recovery is, I love to say this, about so much more than sobriety. It's about so much more than stopping a behavior. It's about becoming someone new. And, I love that scripture about being new creations. In Christ, we're new creations. I think recovery is an opportunity for us to walk in that and learn how to live as a new creation. And so my own experience of recovery over time has been learning how to live as a person who doesn't use substances, but also as a person who is emotionally healthy on the good days. I'm not perfect. I'm human. Physically healthy. Again, I'm human, but being able to walk that out over time as a process. So I love talking about addiction recovery. And I think it's really important, especially now, your listeners, folks likely are listening to this because they're impacted in some way. They know someone. We all know someone. We need to talk about the realities of what it really is so that we can continue to bring solutions to our communities and share recoveries, not just out there somewhere, right? But in our homes, in our churches. So.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the woman who's listening, who hears this description of freedom and healing. And that sounds very much in some church traditions like you just need a healing intervention. You need to have more faith, even. And then Jesus has the power to heal you. And yet, I know a lot of people who have prayed and prayed on behalf of somebody else or even for themselves in the midst of addiction, and God has not brought the lightning bolt recovery down. Before we get any further, can you speak to that idea that may be floating out there in certain church circles?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that to mind. I think it's really important to say and just kind of like call it out. Some people do experience that lightning bolt, and I love that for people. I do. I love that for people. And I'm raising my hand. I did not experience that lightning bolt. And I would say a majority of the people that I work with, mentor over the years, encounter in any capacity, whether I'm speaking, wherever I'm at, have not experienced that lightning bolt. And it's not because God can't do the impossible and God doesn't deliver us in a miraculous way, because I know that does happen and there is this amazing healing that can come. But God works through the recovery journey as just that. It is a walking out, just like our faith. I mean, for me, faith and recovery, it's very connected. It's like, it's almost like the same room, but it's a walking out. And so just because we don't have an answered prayer, and I experienced this in my own life. I mean, I spent it was almost 20 years of using substances, praying, pleading. Even before I knew who God was, I was seeking him, desiring freedom from this thing that I was in bondage from. But through that persistence in my seeking him for this, I think that deliverance came in such a beautiful, powerful way, and that I can speak that into the lives of other people today. And it's a real walking out of the journey. And so my heart just goes out to so many, especially parents and mothers who might be praying for a loved one and waiting and agonizing. Doesn't mean that God is not working. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that recovery isn't happening. One of the things and misconceptions I love to share is that relapse or recurrence of use can be a part of the journey. So, when I was a teenager, really struggling with addiction, went to treatment for the first time, came out, ended up using again, went to treatment and came out and ended up
Mm-hmm.
using again. My family saw that as I was doing this to them. Like, how could I do this to our family that I just wasn't able to stop? I could choose to stop. When in reality, what we know now, we know so much more from the research. What we know now is that recurrence of use or relapse impacts between 40 to 60% of people in addiction recovery. And for certain substances like nicotine, any former
Mm-hmm.
smokers out there, or opioids, that can be upwards of 90% of people experience a recurrence of use. So just because someone uses again doesn't mean they're not on the recovery road. Like, just
Mm-hmm.
because they might need another type of treatment doesn't mean that other treatment didn't work. And so the more that we can talk about that, I think it is such an encouragement to families, such an encouragement. Just because X, Y, or Z didn't work at this point, or we don't think it worked, God is planting a seed and God is watering that seed. And then people come along and help support, that person. So I think it's really important to help address some of those misconceptions. And it kind of goes back to that foundational question of like, where is God when it hurts?
Mm-hmm.
Where is God? Is he going to answer this prayer? I think we all have our stories that we're walking out, but I firmly believe that if we have persistence in our prayer and our hope for our loved one and our love, and we show up in ways that are helpful, that is going to go a really long way, in the long term.
Mm-hmm. I would love to hear a little of your story and
Mm.
how people either loved you in a way that was helpful or loved you, but their tactics just were not helpful in your recovery process. Because I think intentions can be good and actions may not be productive.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'll start with the helpful. My addiction, it started very early. I started drinking when I was about 9, 10, 11. And then that spiraled into heavier substance use. I had experienced trauma as a child, sexual abuse, and then a lot of trauma, especially sexual trauma during my active addiction as a teen and 20 something. And so really broken, really broken.
Mm-hmm.
And understandably, my parents had no idea like how to show up for me. And we didn't have the information we have today back in the like late 80s, early 90s, all of that. But one of the things that I'll never forget my dad did when I was 17 and I was really struggling and I was living outside of the home because they were like, they couldn't even have me in the house at that point. And he came to pick me up at this rundown apartment I was living in. And it makes me emotional thinking about it. But he pulled me into him and just gave me this hug, and it had been a long time from that moment since I had had a hug from my dad. And he gave me a hug and he looked at me and he just said, oh, honey. And I could just feel this. I could feel his care and concern for me. And then he took me out for lunch and then he took me grocery shopping.
Mm-hmm.
And it was such a simple, looking back, it was such a simple kind of these actions, a hug, a meal, groceries. But he was showing up and he was meeting my basic needs. And he was meeting that basic desire that I had to feel loved and accepted, no matter what I was doing, no matter what my behavior was, no matter my addiction and how that was manifesting in my life. And so him showing up for me in that way, meeting my basic needs and just loving me, I'll never forget that. And I've never forgotten that moment. And when families ask me today, what's the best thing I can do to show up for my loved one? If they're still using, because people are afraid of enabling and, some of these other words that I'd love to talk about in a little bit. But, it's just these simple actions of love, a text, a call, a hug. I think we overcomplicate things sometimes. And it's interesting that is like the memory I have, the most impactful way that my family showed up for me. Now, on the flip side of that, I think one of the things that would have been helpful for me as a teen, I mentioned all the trauma I had been through. when I started using substances as a child, instead of someone asking me what happened, that I was turning towards this, people asked me, what's wrong with you? You know, why are you doing this? What's wrong with you? Why are you doing this to us? And so I think remembering or being reminded of the fact that usually when people are using drugs or alcohol, or fill in the blank, maybe it's pornography, there's a deeper underlying issue going on. And that the addiction is just a symptom of something deeper. And so I encourage folks today, like, don't shy away from asking that question of your loved one. If you've noticed their behavior changing, if you've noticed maybe their grades dropping or their appearance looks different, they don't care as much about what they look. If you're noticing some of these signs and you're like, your parent or your loved one, like, red flag, that alarm bell's going off, ask the question. Ask the question, you know, what happened? How can I support you? That is, I think, one of the best ways that we can show up and really care for our people who might be struggling.
Yeah. I often wonder what is being medicated. And it can be through substance, but it could also be behaviors, right? Like when I am reaching for my phone, what am I self-medicating in that moment? And there's always a deeper desire, because my innate desire is not to watch stupid TikTok videos. There's something about my boredom, my reaching, that is involved in something deeper. But I think often the bigger the trauma or the bigger the pain that we are not wanting to face, the harder the addiction as far as the tools that we reach for. And so it doesn't surprise me to hear that you had trauma. And yet not every person who is in recovery has had trauma. Many families can just see this family tree, right, of use, maybe alcohol use, for generations. What is your understanding as far as genetics goes?
I mean, what the science shows is yes. You know, it's kind of that whole like nature versus nurture argument, right? There is a genetic predisposition. And so, like with my kiddos, you know, with my kids, I have already started having those conversations. You have a genetic predisposition. A lot of people in recovery also are bringing their loved ones, bringing their kids along on the journey now, so that if and when, hopefully not when, but if their loved one starts going down that road and struggles with that same issue with addiction, that they already have their eyes open to what's possible in terms of support. And I know a lot of people, and that's such an encouragement to me, who are in recovery, who have adult children who are now in recovery because they saw their parents walk that out. And so we might have cycles and generational cycles of addiction. And we are having generational cycles of recovery. And I think that is such a beautiful truth. And so, yes, there's this kind of worry and concern. And of course, as a mother, I'm like, oh, you know, I don't want my kids to go through this. And especially my daughter, I mean, I knew the dangerous places I was in as a young woman under the influence of substances. And yet God has provided a way. And because of things like social media, and I have a usually hate relationship with social media. Don't tell Meta, but people are more visible about recovery, and people are more vocal about their journeys today. And I think that is such a hopeful thing for the generations coming up. My hope and prayer is that, just like I shared, you know, we have these generational cycles of addiction, that these generational cycles of recovery will break those chains, and we are going to be living collectively more free in that area. So,
well, so let's say someone is in recovery now, and there is a listener who wants to be a support. What is their starting place? How do they approach being a supportive person in a way that feels both healthy and not enabling and productive?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you brought up that term. So there's a lot of ways that we've approached supporting someone, whether they're struggling with addiction of any kind, again, or in recovery. And that's kind of around this fear that if we do or say the wrong thing, that we're going to either enable them, we might cause them to use, you might have heard the word codependent, we're going to be codependent, or, if we don't show tough love, X, Y, or Z is going to happen. I think we need to reframe some of those conversations. And that's really where the new evidence is showing the effectiveness of that simple act of love. Like I shared with my dad, meeting basic needs, not being as concerned about, is this loving action going to harm or help? But like, is this loving action going to be supportive of someone I care about? Will taking them to get groceries be helpful for them in this moment? And I had a mentor early on in my recovery. I was really worried, and I don't even remember at the time what the decision was. I was so worried about, if I do this or if I do that. And she was like, I'll never forget, because it really humbled me. But she was like, Caroline, you're not that powerful. And it's like, ooh. And there's so much truth to that. Like, I can do or say the wrong thing, and I'm human, and that's okay. But I think the important thing is remembering, like, we need to show up for our loved ones. And sometimes that is messy. And sometimes we will say the wrong thing, and that's okay. And so one of the most important things when we're looking at loving someone in recovery is just showing up as ourselves, vulnerable, real, sometimes messy, and showing up anyways, and just letting people know we're there and that we care. And the other thing is, and I've joked with some of my friends because I'm part of a small group and I'm the only woman in recovery, and there's a group of us, and so we'll go out for dinner and they'll be ordering their drinks and stuff. And at first, everyone was very nervous around me. They were like, oh my gosh, she's in recovery. What are we going to do? Can we drink? Can we do this? I just had to laugh. And I'm like, look, just don't make it weird. Don't make it weird. Like, don't make it awkward. It doesn't have to be. Just ask me. And now it's so nice because they'll be like, hey, are you comfortable with this? Or, they'll do their own thing. And if I'm uncomfortable, I'm a grown up. I can leave. So, like we don't have to make it this thing that isn't just a natural part of being. And I like to say too, like, recovery is incredible. And I want everyone to hear about it and know about it. And so most of us who are in longer term recovery feel that way. We're happy to tell you what's supportive for us. We're happy to bring you along on our journey and let you know what's comfortable or what's not, or things like that.
So it sounds like showing love and support, that's going to be individual, right? Based on relationship, based on the person that you're caring for. Are there some general buckets of ways that people can be supportive if someone is in recovery and working hard and they want to be supported?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think being available to ask open-ended questions. So around like, what is supportive for you? Or, if they might be celebrating a milestone, asking like, would you like to be recognized for this? How can I come alongside you and really celebrate you? I think that's something that folks maybe sometimes overlook, but it's a huge part of encouragement for people in recovery. And so those open-ended questions, just asking, okay, how can I show up and support? Not isolating us, not assuming we don't want to be involved in something, but just including us in kind of maybe decisions about family gatherings or plans or dinners or things like that. Like, we just want to be a part of oftentimes. And then if someone is early on in recovery, because I have a couple years strung together, I think being a little bit more mindful of some of those ways that we can be safe for our loved ones and create spaces where people feel comfortable. So if you are having, let's say there's a holiday, which can be really challenging in early recovery, making sure that there are, let's say, mocktails available or alternatives to just sitting in a room with a bunch of bottles of wine, right? I love going on active walks and having activities at holiday dinners, just being mindful of, okay, put yourself in that person's shoes. What would feel comfortable to them? Or like I shared, just ask, how would holiday dinners be comfortable for you? How can we support your early, recovery? Asking those questions goes a really long way. So yeah, being mindful and just compassionate. If someone's in recovery from, let's say they broke their leg, like, how would we show up for that person? How would we show up? Maybe we'd bring them a meal. Maybe we'd offer to help them with a chore. Maybe we would call them more, text them more, ask them how they're doing. We think about this as a human condition. And one of the troubles that we can struggle with, Like, how can we just show up as a compassionate, supportive friend or family
Mm-hmm.
member, aside from what the issue is, right?
Right. I've heard, and I can't remember who said this, that I feel like this came out during COVID, that the opposite of addiction is community,
Hmm.
that the road to recovery is with other people and fighting isolation.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be in all kinds of ways, right? Like this is not just about the dinner where do we serve the wine or don't we serve the wine, but it's about involving that person in your life so that they are not as isolated and can have a full relational experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's 100% this idea of connection and
Mm-hmm.
fellowship and really truly being available to connect with someone, not just on a superficial level, but inviting them into maybe your home or into your life, sharing what's going on with you. I think one of the things I love about recovery so much is just this vulnerability and this really raw place of honesty. If you go
Mm-hmm.
into a circle of chairs in a recovery space, oftentimes we lead with the worst things. We
Mm-hmm.
lead with the struggles that we're going through, the trials that we're facing. That's our starting point in conversation. And I love that because at this point in my journey, I hate small talk because I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
let's get real quick because
Mm-hmm.
that's the way you build connection. And so maybe you're not in recovery yourself, but if you want to build connection with and show someone that solidarity, like lead with your struggle. Show them what you're dealing with. I think that goes a long way in just building connection and empathy with each other. But yeah, I love that saying, the opposite of addiction is connection or community. And just understanding that Jesus says where two or more are gathered. I mean, there is power in a room of people. There is power when there's more than one person. And when we're isolated, that's when it becomes dangerous, when
Mm-hmm.
more of that struggle with addiction can really increase.
Mm-hmm. Now, would you agree that when people are going through recovery early on, especially, and let's say they're doing some therapy or they're just facing some feelings that they have been avoiding for a long time, that it can be a time of intensity in relationships, especially if the relationship has history and has had some hard bumps? How would you suggest someone be supportive and open to having probably critical conversations about how to move forward, while at the same time maybe providing some boundaries for themselves so that they don't feel steamrolled by someone who has the new lens of honesty?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, I think it's important, especially like you said, it is a very raw time. I mean, I remember in
Mm-hmm.
early recovery feeling like my skin was gone. I just felt like I was just this raw, exposed nerve. And it was like everything was setting me off. And I was very emotional, a lot of tears and so sensitive, but I had to learn how to feel. I
Mm-hmm.
had to learn how to feel again. And that took some time. And what I needed a little bit of distance from those people that were kind of entangled in some of my active addiction and some of that time period of my life. I needed to build new community and new connections. And so I think it's so important, not just for the person struggling with addiction, but for the family to have that support system outside of the relationship with that individual. So maybe if it's a family member and your child is struggling, make sure you're plugged in and connected with a small group at church or a support group for affected family members. And there are so many resources, and I share about this in my book. There are so many resources today for family members impacted by addiction where you can talk to another mother or father or another person who is going through the exact same thing you are, and or to someone who has walked through it and got out the other side. So making sure that the family member too has support. One of the things I always like to share about is an awesome resource called recovery.com. And so recovery.com is a website that has addiction and mental health treatment, not just for your loved one, but maybe you need to explore some outside support too. So I always recommend people do that because those relationships can be so strained and so hard. And it takes a while, like I shared earlier on, for us to learn how to walk in our newness. And
Yeah.
it is hard and it's messy. And we might feel like that runner, but it does heal over time. And I think that's the thing I hope folks listening can hang on to, is that it changes. And if it's hard now, it can get better. So yeah, but that's a really important topic, I think, to bring up, is just that challenge, especially early on with relationships.
Yeah. And I can imagine that I am picturing a parent who has maybe felt like we've been through it as a family. Like I
Mm-hmm.
have stayed up late at night. I maybe come to the police station, whatever the things are that I have done as
Mm-hmm.
a parent, and I'm feeling exhausted and raw and scared almost to feel hopeful that you're in recovery, because I am scared that this is temporary and that we're going to go back to that really hard phase. What would you say to somebody who really wants to believe on behalf of somebody they love and is really hopeful, and yet that relapse statistic is real that you mentioned at the beginning, and it is part of the experience? How do you live next to someone who is doing their own process and their own journey, but you're going through yours as well? How do you live and hold on to hope in a way where you don't feel like you're going crazy? You're not living in fear constantly that the bottom is going to fall out again.
Mm. Yeah, it's hard to trust, right? It's hard to trust
Mhm.
God with that and to let go when it's so hard to hope. And I've been there, and I've been there behind the scenes recently. I have loved ones that I care about that are struggling. And so that challenge of being able to show up and hope even when it's hard and there's this fear that things are going to go back to the way that they were. I think that, being hopeful and being certain of we can't see is like one of the, like, for me, that's like one of the hardest things about having faith. And yet, through my experience of addiction recovery and then loving people who are struggling, being able to just trust fall, being able to just trust fall into the arms of God with this. And I've been reading a lot. I have it right here, the story of the prodigal son. And one of the lines from that has really just stuck with me, from Luke chapter 15, verse 20. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son. And what's interesting about that is just that idea of, like, while he was still a long way off, like his son was out there in the distance. He didn't know what he was going to be coming to share. He didn't know what state he was in. Maybe he couldn't, maybe, we didn't see him from that far off. And yet he ran. And I just have this image of my mind mentally of extending that love and care and hope for our loved ones, even if we don't know, even if
Mhm.
we don't know. And I wish I had a quick, like, more simple answer for you, Alex, or a formula of how that
Mhm.
happens. But I believe that God does something when we can just extend that care and compassion and have that hope. It might not make sense in the world, to the world's
Mhm.
eyes, but I believe that God blesses that. And we may not see the fruit of our hope and our faith and our belief on this side of heaven, but our hope and our faith and belief will have eternal impact. I believe in
Mhm.
the kingdom of God for our loved ones. And so if you're listening right now and you're struggling with this, I feel you so deeply.
Mhm.
And I just want you to know you can still hang on to hope if it's hard.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a great visual to think of the sun coming, seeing him running maybe on the horizon, and the dad recognizes that it's him. Because I think that uncertainty, what is actually running toward them, what version of him is running toward them?
Mhm.
Because I think so many parents are like, I'm not sure when that phone rings what version I'm going to get, or a spouse, right? I'm not sure. Am I going to get the sober version or the drunk version if I answer the
Mhm.
phone? And to recognize that we can extend compassion we may have to have some boundaries in place for safety. And at the same time, we can still extend compassion with boundaries, and that there is a wildness to God's grace that we can offer people. I would love to end by you telling us a little bit about your book. So you mentioned it a couple of times, but I'm not sure if we even said the title at the beginning. So I want to end so that people hear the title and can go straight to Amazon and buy it. It is titled When You Love Someone in Recovery. Tell us what a reader finds when they pick up that book.
Yeah. When you love someone in recovery, the subtitle is A Hopeful Guide to Understanding Addiction. And so, again, bringing it back to this idea of hope, what I really wanted to create for families and loved ones is a resource to be able to walk through not just what addiction is. And we touched on a little bit of it today, but from a neuroscience perspective, from a physical perspective, from a mental health, and from a spiritual perspective, but also what recovery is. That it's about so much more than meetings in dark church basements. It's a way of life. Even though meetings in dark church basements are awesome and are a part of it for many of us, but it's a way of life. And I think when we understand what our loved one might be working towards with their sobriety or their treatment, when we can understand the fullness of the life that comes from living and walking out recovery, I think we can understand and have more compassion and empathy and hope for our loved ones who might be on that journey. So I'm hoping that it not only redefines what recovery is, but also addresses some of the misconceptions that a lot of us have held for a long time that have prevented us from showing up in a way that can really be a support to those that we care about.
Great. Well, I have looked through it, but I look forward to reading it in more depth. And I want to hear from our listeners who pick it up and read it too. So please message me if this topic has felt relevant to you and if this book is something that you are working through, because I want to be praying for you in that. Thank you, Caroline, for joining us. Thank you for sharing your life with us and with so many people that are in this recovery journey, and those of us that are standing next to people who are in recovery. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.